The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Dim lights hung faintly above, passengers leaned against their headrests, and the steady drone of the engines promised a peaceful flight. For most, this was an ordinary trip, but for 13-year-old Malik Johnson, Flight 482 to Washington, D.C. was a dream come true, his very first time flying. Malik, bright-eyed, polite, his backpack neatly tucked under the seat, held a puzzle book in his lap. His mother had kissed him goodbye at the terminal, telling him to be brave, reminding him this trip to visit his uncle was a big adventure. He was nervous, but more than that, he was excited. The sky was his playground now, but in the aisle, a storm was quietly brewing. "Excuse me, sir, may I please have a soda?" Malik asked softly, looking up at the flight attendant, Richard Hayes. Hayes was a man whose uniform seemed to weigh more than the responsibility it symbolized. Stern-faced, impatient, and notorious among colleagues for his short temper, he looked down at the boy with thinly veiled irritation. "You'll have to wait," Hayes snapped, moving down the aisle. Malik blinked, confused. He wasn't trying to be rude. He sank back into his seat, cheeks warm with embarrassment as passengers glanced over. He waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. He tried again, politely. This time, Hayes didn't just dismiss him. He exploded. "What did I say?" Hayes barked, voice cutting through the cabin. Before anyone could react, he grabbed Malik's arm, and in a flash of anger, struck the boy across the face. The sound, a sickening crack. Gasps filled the air. A woman shrieked. Phones were pulled out, recording instantly. Malik clutched his jaw, tears spilling down his cheeks as muffled sobs broke the tense silence. Hayes stood over him, flustered, barking about respect and discipline, trying desperately to justify the unjustifiable. But the sight was undeniable, a 13-year-old boy, bleeding and broken in his seat. And what Hayes didn't realize was that 3 rows away, someone of unimaginable importance had witnessed every second. Judge Eleanor Whitman, one of the most respected federal judges in the country, known for her uncompromising stance on civil rights, Whitman had boarded the plane intending to review briefs. Now, her steely eyes were locked on Hayes, her decision made before she even rose from her seat. She stood, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Her presence was commanding, the kind of authority that silences chaos. "Step back," she ordered. Her voice was low, steady, and undeniable. Every passenger froze. This was no ordinary traveler. Hayes hesitated, suddenly aware that something had gone very, very wrong. Judge Whitman bent to Malik's side, gently cradling his shoulders, assuring him that none of this was his fault. And then she turned to the captain, her words firm and final. "This boy will receive medical care the moment we land, and justice," she glanced sharply at Hayes, "will not be delayed." The hum of the engines carried on, but everything else had changed. Passengers whispered, cameras rolled, and the first sparks of a national storm were ignited in that dimly lit cabin. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, take a moment to subscribe. I've worked hard to bring this to life, and your support means the world to me. Malik Johnson had never been on a plane before. For weeks leading up to the trip, he had been counting down the days on a calendar. His uncle, a retired Army officer living in Washington, D.C., had promised to show him the monuments, the museums, even the Pentagon. To Malik, this wasn't just a vacation, it was a rite of passage. At 13, Malik was curious, bright, and endlessly polite. His teachers often described him as the kind of boy who thanks you twice for the same thing. But beneath his excitement lay a quiet nervousness. Flying was new, overwhelming, and he wanted everything to go smoothly. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes was no stranger to the skies. For nearly 2 decades, he had walked the aisles in his crisp uniform, serving drinks and managing passengers. But colleagues knew him as a man easily provoked, one whose sense of authority often bled into arrogance. Some excused it as stress, others whispered that he carried prejudices he barely bothered to conceal. The flight itself began ordinarily enough. Passengers shuffled on, bags stuffed overhead, babies fussing as parents tried to soothe them. Malik found his seat near the middle, clutching his backpack like a lifeline. Judge Whitman sat just a few rows ahead, files spread neatly across her tray table. She was traveling incognito, but even incognito, she radiated the quiet composure of someone used to making decisions that could change lives. An hour into the flight, when Malik's small hand went up to ask for a soda, he expected nothing more than a smile in a can. Instead, he collided headfirst with Hayes's simmering disdain. The first dismissal cut Malik deeply, though he tried not to show it. The second time, when Hayes's voice rose and his temper snapped, passengers began to exchange uneasy glances. Some shook their heads, some whispered, No one intervened, and then came the strike. Brutal, unnecessary, shocking. For Malik, the world tilted. Pain shot through his jaw, his body trembling as his vision blurred with tears. His first flight, the adventure he had begged for, had turned into a nightmare of humiliation and violence. For the passengers, it was disbelief. Did that really just happen? Someone whispered. Cameras caught the scene from different angles. Already, messages were flying through the air on social media. Flight attendant assaults boy on flight 482. But for Judge Eleanor Whitman, there was no hesitation. She was a woman forged in courtrooms where silence equaled complicity. She had spent years battling systemic injustices, reminding America that dignity was not a privilege but a right. As she rose from her seat and confronted Hayes, she knew this was not just about a soda, a strike, or a boy. It was about power, who wielded it, who abused it, and who would stand against it. The inciting incident had begun. What should have been a quiet flight was now a stage for justice, and every single passenger had a role to play. If you had been on flight 482 that night, sitting just a row away, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have spoken up, or stayed silent? The cabin had become a stage of stunned silence. Malik sat trembling, his small hands pressed to his jaw, his eyes shimmering with pain and confusion. Every second stretched unbearably long. No child should have to endure such humiliation, let alone at the hands of someone entrusted with safety. Hayes, breathing heavily, tried to mask his actions with authority. He needs to learn respect, he muttered, scanning the passengers as if daring anyone to challenge him. But the weight of dozens of disbelieving stares bore down on him. Phones were raised higher now. Whispered conversations crackled like sparks across the rows. Did you see that? Is he bleeding? Is this really happening? Judge Whitman stood tall, her figure commanding even in the cramped aisle. Her voice cut through the tension like a gavel striking wood. Mr. Hayes, step back. Her words weren't loud, but their authority was undeniable. Hayes faltered, his jaw tightening, his face flushing red. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but something in Whitman's eyes froze him in place. Passengers leaned forward, sensing that the dynamic had shifted. Malik, still crying, turned toward her, as though instinctively recognizing she was someone who could be trusted. The captain was called. The crew gathered nervously, unsure how to manage the spectacle unfolding in full view of recording passengers. Every move, every word, would soon be replayed by millions online. Medical assistance will be waiting upon landing, Whitman demanded. This child needs immediate care, and Hayes, she locked eyes with him, will be held accountable. Hayes's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew his career was slipping through his fingers in real time, but instead of remorse, his expression hardened, resentment boiling beneath the surface. As the plane descended into Washington, whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into debates. Some passengers comforted Malik, offering tissues, water, quiet words of encouragement. Others kept recording, determined that the world should see. By the time the wheels hit the runway, Flight 482 was already trending. Clips of Hayes striking Malik spread across social media like wildfire. Outrage ignited instantly. Hashtags of justice for Malik and accountability now flooded timelines. The cabin doors opened to chaos. Airport medics rushed in to stabilize Malik. His mother, alerted by frantic phone calls, was waiting in the terminal, her face pale with fear as she ran toward her son. She clutched him to her chest, tears streaming, whispering his name over and over. Malik tried to speak but could only manage muffled sounds through the pain. Her cries echoed in the terminal, drawing sympathetic glances and cameras alike. Judge Whitman identified herself to airline management right there at the gate. I am Judge Eleanor Whitman, she declared firmly, and I witnessed everything. This matter will not disappear quietly, not under my watch, the airline executive stammered, promising investigations, but Whitman's tone left no room for empty reassurances. Malik's broken jaw had already become more than an injury, it was the start of a movement. Back at home that night, the news cycle exploded. Cable anchors replayed the footage endlessly. Commentators debated, was this an isolated incident of unchecked temper, or part of a deeper, systemic problem, prejudice woven into the fabric of authority? Meanwhile, Malik lay in a hospital bed, his jaw wired shut, his mother at his side. The world watched, but for Malik, the pain was real, immediate, and deeply personal. He scribbled notes on a pad of paper to communicate. One message he wrote again and again, why me? The courtroom was packed weeks later when the case of State versus Richard Hayes began. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but journalists painted vivid word pictures for the public waiting outside. Hayes walked in stiffly, wearing a suit instead of a uniform, his jaw clenched tight. His lawyer painted him as a dedicated employee under stress, arguing that the incident had been a tragic misunderstanding, but the world had already seen the footage. The video spoke louder than any defense. Then came the surprise, a revelation that shifted the case from a trial about a single assault to something much larger. Judge Eleanor Whitman, though not presiding, was called to testify as a witness. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell utterly silent. Everyone knew her reputation. Everyone knew her words could sway the course of justice. She described what she had seen with chilling precision, the dismissive tone, the escalation, the violent strike. But she didn't stop there. She spoke of patterns, of the dangers of unchecked authority, of how silence in the face of abuse perpetuates injustice. Her testimony wasn't just about Malik. It was about every vulnerable person who had ever been told to respect authority, even as that authority harmed them. The defense squirmed. They hadn't counted on someone of Whitman's stature not only witnessing the act, but publicly condemning it. The jury leaned in, hanging on every word. The balance of power in the courtroom had shifted. Hayes was no longer just a man accused. He was a symbol, and Judge Whitman had just drawn the battle lines. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, protests swelled. Signs with Malik's name dotted the crowd. Chants of justice for Malik rang out daily. News outlets compared the case to historic civil rights battles, framing it as more than one boy's suffering. Malik himself, still healing, watched from home. His jaw remained tender, but his spirit began to strengthen. He saw strangers holding signs with his name, demanding justice on his behalf. For the first time since the assault, he felt something stir inside him, hope, but with that hope came a burden. The trial was no longer just about him. It was about a nation wrestling with its conscience, and he, at only 13, had become its reluctant symbol. As the prosecution rested, revealing the damning medical reports and passenger testimonies, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. Hayes's lawyer warned the jury not to be swept away by emotion, insisting that punishment should not be based on outrage. But the truth was undeniable. The boy's jaw had been broken. The videos showed the strike, and Judge Whitman's words had left no room for doubt about what justice demanded. The act closed on a knife's edge. Would the jury side with cold legal technicalities, or with the weight of truth and conscience? If you're in the jury's seat right now, watching the footage and hearing Whitman's testimony, what would you decide? Guilty, or not guilty? The air inside the courtroom felt heavier as the trial reached its climax. Every seat was filled, and the overflow crowd gathered outside hung on every update delivered by reporters. Inside, the prosecution's closing argument cut deep. This case is not just about a broken jaw. It is about trust. Trust placed in authority that was betrayed. Malik Johnson is a child. He boarded that flight with excitement, not fear. Richard Hayes was entrusted to protect passengers, not harm them. And the evidence shows beyond any doubt, he chose violence. The room was silent, except for the prosecutor's voice echoing like a hammer. Hayes's attorney countered, painting him as a man unfairly vilified. One moment of misjudgment, he argued, should not define a lifetime of service. Do not let public outrage blind you to fairness. But fairness, the jury knew, was already fractured. The footage replayed in their minds, Malik's muffled sobs a haunting soundtrack. Judge Whitman, sitting in the gallery, remained composed but unyielding. She knew that the verdict would ripple far beyond these walls. This was about more than one boy and one flight attendant. This was about whether justice could still mean something tangible in an age when authority so often went unchecked. As deliberations began, tension spilled into the streets. Protesters clutched signs, chanted Malik's name, and demanded accountability. Cable news tickers ran non-stop updates. Social media pulsed with debates. Was Hayes a rogue actor, or a symptom of something larger? Hours passed. The nation waited. When the jury finally filed back in, the atmosphere was electric. Malik, sitting between his mother and his uncle, clutched his mother's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mother whispered, "Whatever happens, we're proud of you." The foreman stood, voice steady but solemn. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Gasps erupted. Some wept, others cheered. Malik's mother collapsed into tears, pulling her son into her arms. The boy, his face still marked with healing scars, managed a fragile smile through his own tears. Hayes sat frozen, the color draining from his face. His attorney slumped beside him, the weight of defeat undeniable. The gavel struck. The trial was over. Justice had spoken. The sentencing weeks later sealed Hayes's fate. He was stripped of his position, fined heavily, and given prison time. To some, it was too much. To others, far too little. But one truth was clear: he would never again walk the aisles of a plane in uniform. Malik's story, however, didn't end in the courtroom. It ignited something far larger. Airlines nationwide scrambled to review their training and disciplinary procedures. Lawmakers pushed for stronger passenger protections, especially for minors. Advocacy groups gained traction, using justice for Malik as a rallying cry. In schools, children spoke Malik's name. In churches, sermons wove his story into lessons about dignity and courage. In households, parents sat with their children and said, "If you ever feel powerless, remember this boy, remember what he stood for." For Malik, recovery was slow but steady. The wires in his jaw eventually came out, leaving scars that would never fully fade. Yet those scars became symbols, not of weakness, but of resilience. He returned to school, where classmates greeted him not with pity, but with admiration. At a community event months later, Malik stood nervously at a podium, facing hundreds who had gathered in his honor. He fiddled with a microphone, glancing at his mother in the front row. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," he said softly, "but you did, you all did, and now, I believe in me too." The crowd erupted into applause. His mother wept openly. His uncle stood tall, pride written across his face, and Judge Whitman, watching from the back, allowed herself a rare smile. She had seen countless cases in her career, but few had left such an indelible mark. For Hayes, the aftermath was harsh. His name became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that authority cannot excuse cruelty. From prison, he released statements of regret, though many doubted their sincerity. His legacy was sealed, not by years of service, but by one unforgivable act. And for Judge Whitman, the flight that began as routine travel had become a turning point. She reminded the nation that justice is not confined to a courtroom. It lives in every moment we choose to confront abuse, to speak truth, to protect the vulnerable. The boy who had once scribbled "Why me?" on a hospital notepad now had his answer. He had become more than a victim. He was a symbol of courage, of resilience, and of what justice looks like when good people refuse to stay silent. The story of Flight 482 would live on, not as a tale of despair, but as proof that even in the darkest moments, justice and power can collide to change lives. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Was justice truly served here, or do you think more should have been done? Share your opinion in the comments below, and if you found Malik's story powerful, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Together, we can keep shining a light on stories of justice and power.